Alrighty folks, and welcome to the Chronicler podcast channel. Episode 5, Fall of the Xia, Rise of the Shang. Last time, we looked into the Xia dynasty and what it brought to the population of the Yellow River Valley. And by the population, I mean the Han culture. This time, we will look at the end of the Xia and the establishment of the Shang in 1600 BC, as well as the influence of the Shang themselves. So for example, we will look at the oracle bones and how they were discovered, the religious role that the oracle bones played, the military, and the socio-economic relations of the time. So as the Xia monarch, Jie, was hell-bent on a road to disaster, the Shang were building in strength. The man I want to point to is named Zilu, who would later be known as Tang, or Tan Shang, or Tang of Shang. I don't know why, but his name has a nice ring to it. Maybe it's the rhyme. But for the purpose of keeping things easy, I will call him Tang of Shang, or simply just Tang. Noticing that he wasn't the only one disgruntled with Jie's rule, Tang started secretly meeting other vassals of the Xia and concocting a plan to rebel against Jie. Tang was certainly the most kindest of all the Xia vassals, he was certainly the most characteristic, and he was definitely the most ambitious. So naturally, he became the leader of the rebellion. Now of course, when the rebellion got underway, Tang completely surprised Jie and knocked the vassals loyal to the Xia out of the conflict extremely quickly. Jie now had to personally deal with Tang, and so the king marched his imperial army to war. It was here, at the Battle of Mingtiao in modern-day Henan province, that the two forces lined underneath a huge storm, Tang on one side and Jie on the other. Tang made a rousing speech telling his men the corruption endorsed by Jie, while the men on his side suffered. He also let it be known that those who fought with him would be on the right side of history, freeing them to do as they pleased after their military service. The result was a mighty roar from his men, and they charged. Jie's men on the other side also heard the speech, and then thought, wait a minute, why am I fighting for this guy? And as the armies clashed, Jie's front line quickly turned around and fought those behind him. And like a wave, most of the others followed suit. They could see where the tide was turning. So to say the least, the battle was pretty much over before it's begun. Jie's army was routed and the king had to flee. So that was that. In the space of one battle, 500 years of rule was over, and a new order was in place. But what do we know about the battle itself? Not much. We don't know any numbers or anything. Tang's speech that he made was known as Tang's Pledge, and by all accounts, this is true. The storm is also true. Funny that. You can record the weather on the day of a battle, but not rough truth numbers. Yeah, alright. If anyone does know these numbers, please drop them in the comments. I can make amendments for the next episode. Now, as much as this was a good thing, because Jie was, well, you know, really horrible, Tang set in motion a series of events that would be the common theme of Chinese history for the next 4,000 years, and that was the cycle of overthrowing a dynasty through military means. Now Tang obviously didn't know this at the time, but yeah, he set a pretty gruesome trend. Now back to Jie. So what happened to him? Well, he was forced into exile and died a few years later, and with him, any resurgence of the Xia dynasty. And his wife Moxi? Well, she committed suicide before Tang's men ever reached her. Which is, you know, fair enough. I mean, I think she knew better than anyone. She was as good as dead if Tang got a hold of her. Now then, Tang had established a new order. Quite the feat. And a new dynasty was born. And you will be glad to hear this, the Shang is proven to be historical fact. Hooray! Get the champagne out, get the whiskey out, or get the Prosecco, or whatever it is that you drink, because moving forward, we can use tangible evidence. So how do we know the Shang were real? through these remarkable things called oracle bones. The concept is rather simple, which we will get into later, but for now, I want to focus on how they were found, which is rather extraordinary. Now I know what you're thinking. The bones must have been discovered after the fall of the Shang, right? Right? Nah. Try 1899. So what's that, like 4,000 odd years later? Sorry, I might be good at history, but my mathematical skills are terrible. Before this, scholars assumed the earliest form of Chinese writing came from the Qin dynasty, but no, it goes way further back than that. 1600 years before, and the story goes a little like this. A politician who was also a bronze collector at the time, named Wang Yirong, and I'll say his name again, Wang Yirong, was sick with malaria, and he needed medicine. He went to a local shop and asked for some traditional Chinese medicine to cure his illness. The pharmacist gave him bones, and told him to grind them up and then drink them in his tea. This wasn't unusual, by the way. Some traditional Chinese medicines can be rather bizarre. But in my time here, I haven't drunk or even seen animal bones to be used as medicine. I've only stuck to the herbs. After taking them home, Wang Yirong noticed there were inscriptions on the bones. And they didn't look like inscriptions from the Han Dynasty either. They went way further back. He then invited his friend Liu Yi to examine the bones with him. Obviously, they knew they had stumbled onto something big here, so they went back to the pharmacy and began to ask questions. Unfortunately for Wang, malaria was the least of his worries, as he was accused of participating in the Boxer Rebellion, and as a result committed suicide. What is the Boxer Rebellion, you ask? That is something we will get into in around 1 billion podcast time. No, seriously, I have no clue how long this will go on for, and one thing that I'm certain of is that it's going to be at least 2 years before I can even think about completing this. Now, after his death, the mantle was then passed from Wang to his friend Liu Yi, who managed to find the site of the bones in Anyang, in today's modern Henan province. This was also the site of the last Shang capital. I'm going to use a quote from a book by the author Yahweh Shu, which I think sums up this whole scenario rather well. No one can know how many oracle bones prior to 1899 were ground up by traditional Chinese pharmacies and disappeared into people's stomachs. So that's all fine and well. We know that the oracle bones originated with the Shang, but what exactly did they mean? It was actually divinations. So what would happen is that a local shaman, now this could be a man or a woman by the way, early Chinese societies weren't as patriarchal as they would be later on. But we will get into that as time progresses. But anyway, the shamans would come to a local village and perform a service to address the ancestors. Now it isn't as if the shaman would wander around randomly, they were ordered to by the religious head of the state. And who was that? The Shang King, of course. Not only did the king play a governmental role in the lives of the people, but also a religious one too. I suppose it makes sense. As king, you would want to know where the ancestors are pleased and where they are not happy with your kingdom. Now then, back to the shamans and their bones. They would use tortoise shells or the shoulder blades of oxen or cows to write the questions people would ask them. Now these questions varied from person to person. Some would ask if they would get a good harvest that year, some merchants would ask if they would get a good trade that season, and the social elites would ask more specific questions. Ones like, will my reign as king be a good one? Will there be any natural disasters? And the list goes on. Once the question was asked and inscribed on the bones, the shaman would then toss them into a fire, and everyone would watch the bones splinter and crack. The shaman was the person who could read these cracks and decipher the ancestors' answer. That would then get documented. The cool thing is that after the allocated time slot, so like a week or a month or a year, whatever it was, the shaman would return and ask if the divination came true and then document what happened. I will run by 3 examples. Question: will I be able to sell my cow this month? Divination: yes. Result: cow was sold that month. Now that was rather simple, so I'll try to move on to something a little more complex. Question: will I win a battle this year? Answer: yes. Result: won the battle but at heavy losses. And the last one? Question: will there be any natural disasters this year? Answer: no. Result: there was a drought. That's the thing. Not all divinations were correct, and one could argue that if their question was answered in an unsatisfactory way, the individual would try extra hard to prove otherwise. Some would even ask about the gender of their babies, especially the social elites, who wanted male heirs at the time. Now this is rather remarkable. I would highly recommend looking at my Instagram or Facebook pages where I've posted a few pictures of what the bones look like now. Or you can do a Google search, whichever is easier. So that's all fine and well with the Shang then, and it proves they were a true entity. But apart from burning bones, what else did they achieve or accomplish? Well, they did spread their influence further than the Xia ever did, conquering beyond the reaches of the Yellow River Valley, reaching the coast of Shandong province, and even getting further south to the Yangtze River Delta. So how did they do this? To start off, I will mention troop numbers. The Shang would have travelled in around groups of 5,000 men at the very highest level. Well, apart from very special occasions, which I will talk about next week. And they would raid neighbouring tribes, then declare them a vassal of the central state, and then move on. And so the cycle continued. Now, I know the troop numbers weren't too high, but please remember this is between 1600 and 1046 BC. Human populations weren't exactly high, like today. Also, the chariot. The chariot's influence in warfare had now spread, and this new tech filtered through to the Shang dynasty. Kinda through a de facto Silk Road, I guess. Now, traditional Chinese sources say the chariot was invented by a Xia minister named Xizhong, but there is no evidence to support this, so please don't buy into that. It's more than likely that the chariot was invented in Mesopotamia, and its influence spread far and wide, towards the west and towards the east. Now I think we all know what a chariot is, but for those of you who don't, it is a cart that is dragged by horses with soldiers stationed in it. During the Shang era, the soldiers usually on the cart were an archer accompanied by a spearman, as well as the driver. These war machines were the modern day equivalent of a tank. They were very hard to stop, they were fast, powerful, and devastating to enemy formations, if they were used correctly. Which brings me to this question: did chariots have such a profound impact? Honestly, I think chariots were more of a morale shock than anything else. And as well as that, what if it was really rainy day and the terrain became very boggy? The chariots then becomes useless. And to top it off, it was only social elites who could afford and use a chariot. It was more to show your position in society. It was very much like medieval Europe, where a knight would show off his prestige with the breed of his horse, and he would say, "Look at my stallion." Whereas in Shang China, it was, "Look at my chariot." That's not to say though, that the chariot was useless. If it was useless, then nobody would have used it, and it certainly would not have had such a profound impact on the spread of the Han ethnic group, and it wouldn't have been used so widely in later dynasties, as we will soon see. And more to the point, a commander would use a chariot as it would allow him to see over the troop positions and deploy the units of men where they were needed. So apart from chariots, what did the Shang have? I suppose I better start with the most usual soldier, and this was the Dagger Axeman. So what's a dagger axe, you ask? Well, just think of it as a dagger that's put onto a stick. So it's kind of like a spear before it was a spear. Now don't get me wrong, there were spearmen as well, and they also had archers. So yeah, it's kind of what you would expect a Bronze Age army to be like. Now, all soldiers, or should I say most soldiers, also had bronze armour, making it more difficult for their enemies to be effective in close combat. And in turn, they had bronze weapons, so the dagger axe, the dagger part, was made of bronze, which was very effective, and it could slay said enemies. It could be concluded then that the Shang definitely had the advantage when it came to battling neighbouring tribes, and this allowed them to expand as much as they did. They also owe a lot of it to a certain female general as well, but that's a story for next week's podcast. With this new territory, from what I can see, economic inequality at the time began to widen. Evidence of this is a tomb of a nobleman who had 74 human bodies in the grave with him, as well as dogs and even horses, proving the amount of wealth people could accumulate if they were born into the right family, that is. The poor 74 souls that were buried with this nobleman could have been prisoners of war, slaves, or a mixture of the two. So where did this wealth come from? Well, bronze, of course. Now I know the Xia are credited with discovering it through smelting tin and copper, but the Shang took us to a whole new level. Bronze was the metal of the time. If its production could be controlled, new lands could be acquired. It's as simple as that. As much as inequality between the classes began to widen, this suggests that the standards of living improved under the Shang. It's simple. For individuals to get that rich, society itself has to be rich and provide for the needs for those at the top of the social ladder. Now don't get me wrong, it would be awful if you were at the bottom of said social ladder. But I'm talking about the farm workers, the weapons craftsmen, the soldiers, the clay workers. As much as they were respected, they were paid very little. As well as this, larger urban centres are also evidence towards society as a whole getting richer. Cities such as Yan'an and Jinzhou were massive, which later Chinese generations would populate. Now it's to be noted here, these settlements would not have been as populated as urban centres in Mesopotamia at the time. It could be seen with the Shang that society as a whole moved forward. Bronze was being produced in higher quantities, the armed forces were more advanced, religion had a critical role in the Shang kingdom as well, and the kings were the religious heads of state. The population increased, and it seems that society as a whole got richer. But what do you think? Did the Shang achieve a lot more than the Xia, or did they simply continue things on and let things take a natural course of action? Let me know in the comments, and if I missed anything that people want to point out, don't be shy and drop a comment. Also, be sure to share this with people who you think might be interested and give it a rating. This will help the channel to grow. Next time, I will talk about the noteworthy characters during the Shang period and how they influenced the state. So for example, I didn't really talk about Tang at all here, more about the legacy and the dynasty he left behind. So Tang will definitely be mentioned, as well as his great advisor, who was also a very good cook by the way. I will then move on to the Shang woman warrior Fu Hao, who is just awesome, and you will see how she is awesome in next week's episode. As well as her husband, of course. He was one of the best Shang kings during the reign of the Shang after all. Then of course, we will talk about the last ruler of the Shang, and as well as that we will talk about his wife. And yes, they're very much like Jie and Wu Xi, except they're 10 times worse. So I hope you're looking forward to that. And that is a wrap for this week's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you next time on the Chronicler Podcast channel. Thanks for listening.